Welcome everyone to another episode of Caster Calls with ZombieGrub. I think it's episode 23, but I keep forgetting to keep track. It's one of those. And today I'm here with Sideshow or Sideshow Gaming. I assume you just go by Sideshow.
I do,
It's
yeah.
gonna work out. Yeah, nice. So he is well, I mean, you've been a couple of different things at this point, but I know you as an analyst for the Overwatch League, and you were literally on the analyst desk for quite a few years, and they
Yeah.
actually push you guys onto the front lines, and you and Brent have been actually doing casting for the previous year of Overwatch League. So if you don't know him, guys, he's actually a heck of a lot of fun. He's been doing great work. And it seems like you kind of came up at the exact right time, but I think, if I remember correctly, your background is in TF2,
It is,
actually,
yeah.
so it made a lot of sense to go into Overwatch.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was just kind of hanging out for a while, wondering whether it was something that could ever become full time. Not specifically the casting, but just esports in general. I did a bunch of journalist work and some events management and this kind of stuff, like sponsor liaison. I just basically dipped my hand into whatever pool possible. Because I recognize that you just basically need skills and experience in order to get a job in esports. That there's no degree that you can get that will qualify you for any job. So it's basically just, do you understand the space and do you have experience and a willingness to work in the space and kind of learn from your mistakes? So
Yeah.
that's what I did for a bunch of years before Overwatch reared its head, and I decided to try and take the punt over there.
And so were you literally just picking up all the odd jobs? I mean, were you in college when you were doing this, or
Mm.
are you working, or what?
Yeah, I was in college at the time. I was I was kind of in like a weird state because I was a top player in TF2. TF2 had a really small scene, so it always makes me giggle when I say that because I think anyone could have been a top player in TF2 if you just put the time in. And I did. I put like, I think it was like 8,000 hours into that game since 2010 over like the course of something like 4 years, which is an obscene amount of time. That is a ridiculous amount of hours. And then once I was at kind of a top level, I was just happened to be someone who was very heavily invested in the scene because I'd spent so much time in the scene. So I picked up a bunch of different jobs that just needed doing in order to maintain the status quo. I wasn't really trying to push the needle at all. I was just trying to make sure that the matches had people that would be able to cast them, and that people wanted, some roster was changed and people wanted an article written about it. So I would write an article about it. And just slowly over time, that became more and more. I became more and more involved in specifically the European part of the production, which was all run by one organization. And I just started taking on more and more tasks and kind of dipping my toes into different jobs. And at the same time that I was doing that, there was always a push within the TF2 community to become bigger than it actually was. So instead of being a very um, insulated community, it actually was constantly a game where people were looking out at the rest of esports to try and figure out what TF2 had done wrong. Right? It was like we were always looking at other places, specifically the other Valve games like CS and Dota, which is a ridiculous comparison, but it was the one that was most obvious because they're the same publisher. And a lot of people within the community would be like, well, why aren't our games, why aren't our broadcasts able to look like that? Why aren't they able to be, why isn't the same kind of like fan engagement? Why isn't the viewership there? Why aren't the events as big? Why aren't the sponsors interested, etc., etc.? And so just by answering these questions or attempting to answer them took me down paths of looking at other esports and seeing what is done better in those esports, seeing what a more professional scene looks like, learning from other casters and journalists and stuff like that were in those other scenes. So it was a very natural transition then to realize, oh, it is actually possible to make a living in esports. It's just not possible to make a living within TF2. And kind of picking a moment to branch out into something else.
Well, this initial desire, though, it sounds like it was entirely bred from just really liking TF2.
Yes, it totally was. It was a game that one of my school friends introduced me to back in 2010. I don't know how old I was at that time. Let me run the math. I guess I was 15 at the time, and Um, yeah, I got the orange box. Loved all the other games that were in it as well. Played the shit out of Half Life and Portal and stuff. But TF2 was the one that really grabbed my attention because it was the one that he played, and I didn't have. I can't remember whether I was unusual in this sense, but back then, if you wanted to play games with somebody, I would go round to someone's house to play games like a local two-player game with them. In terms of like multiplayer games, most of my friends were console players, so they didn't actually. There wasn't the kind of the same sense of meeting up online and playing with them that you could get when it came to TF2. None of my friends were really into like Counter Strike and stuff like that, so I hadn't been introduced to them. So TF2 was just casual enough that it pulled in one of my other friends to playing it online, and it was a total new experience because you had connections with the players that you actually played with repeatedly. You know, you hop onto a community server and you have leaderboards where you can get better and better. You meet the same people because they come to the same community servers repeatedly. And so it was such a vastly different experience to me than playing multiplayer Call of Duty online, where you're just randomly thrown into lobbies. You never know who you're playing against. Even if you buddy up with somebody, you don't get that same feel. Like your time is actually being used in a social manner as well as in a gaming manner. So yeah, and then obviously the game itself hooked me after the social component, and I just tried to get better and better.
It's kind of odd. 2010 for me was definitely, I mean, obviously that was the year that StarCraft 2 came out, so I was getting into that, but I would have identified it as a long past the point of going to each other's houses and
Yeah.
playing with them. So that is kind of weird to hear. It sounds like TF2 is it brought some of the charm that the years prior had when it came to games
Yes.
because
Yeah.
I played the N64 version of StarCraft with a friend who came over to my house 20 years ago at this point. But as soon as you got into the serious gaming. It was all online by 2010. So I mean that kind of is a good thing sometimes. You said it creates this like really great community, albeit a bit smaller than you would hope, which is unfortunate because I know a lot of people still think that TF2 is the best arena shooter. So
It
that's what it's
was
called.
yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun. It's a good game. Like, it's really well designed. The movement is clean. The mechanics are great. It's got a great balance as well of like team play and individual moments too. It, they never really found a format that worked fantastically. Like the format itself is a little dull at times, but it's also got some really fast paced, great moments. So yeah, I think it was just missing the the little push to get it over the edge because it came before um yeah, it kind of was released at a time when developers weren't thinking about esports whatsoever. Like there were some in other games, obviously, like Quake and Counter Strike and these kind of games have been played competitively for ages before that. But the communities were so niche that the developers, weren't actively supporting it and weren't actively thinking
Right.
about it in terms of marketing or in terms of something that could actually be successful for their game. So it just got lost.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Blizzard had designed StarCraft 2 with the esport in mind, actually. But as far as the format that we know now, the formula that we know now, where it's very publisher driven, it was just totally unknown back in the day, and that was part of Blizzard's problem, at which they learned throughout the years from StarCraft, actually. But
Yeah,
they also didn't push it as a publisher esport. They just let MLGs and IEMs and the DreamHacks pick them up, and so that did usher in kind of what we know as the second coming of esports. I mean, yeah, right. There was CS:GO, there was Quake. There's a lot of things happening over in Europe, but obviously the big explosion was StarCraft One in Korea
sure.
years and years ago. So it's kind of unfortunate that TF2 did come out at that time, especially when you consider that if it come out 6 years later, as Overwatch had done, then that might have been the better market for it as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Shooters grew more and more popular over the years, and clearly RTS, went down and shooters came up in all aspects, including arena shooters, which now is a really big deal because Valorant has also, come out and actually it's very CS:GO, but clearly it's got all those spell casting abilities that gets the more casuals fans hooked. So it's too bad it didn't come out at the right time, but that happens. And obviously it still gave you a fantastic pathway into the
Exactly,
world of
yeah.
esports. So you got a lot to, I guess, you
Yeah.
always feel indebted to your first esport.
And
But
it was a great learning experience for a bunch of people as well. Like so many of the big personalities that are actually involved in Overwatch came from TF2. Like some of the biggest are from there, like Siegel, who streams, and went into doing full time streaming, and then Super, who's currently I think like the biggest streamer that regularly streams the competitive side of Overwatch, is on uh, the double defending champion team, the San Francisco Shock. Back to back champions is better than double defending. That's the normal phrase that people use. And then like Avast, another big community figure, myself and Brent, like so much of the big figures that have actually been successful came from that TF2 community. And I feel like the reason is because you were forced to just do stuff on your own. And you were just forced to do stuff. And if you didn't do stuff, you weren't going to get anywhere. So people, it naturally selected for people who want to get out there and create content and be more vocal and explorative in the kind of stuff that they're interested in doing. Um, which is something that I always recommend to people who are trying to get into casting as well, is just do stuff. And that everyone always says that, and no one provides specific examples ever. So I can imagine being like somebody who's trying to get into casting and they're like, just do stuff. Like what? Like what? Just put up a one view video on my YouTube channel. Like how is that going to help? But I think it's about, finding the areas in which you can actually have impact and going into those areas. So like if you notice that there's nobody who's I don't know, writing articles to cover things, or like no one's doing off-season reporting, or no one's or there's like a gap in some community uh tournament that needs a caster, or interviews. Interviews is a massive one. There are very, very rarely good interviews done in any esports scene that I've looked at, especially when things aren't happening offline, because offline is where people actually directly get into in contact with the players and members of staff and do interviews with them. But I mean, interviews are just like such an easy road of being able to get some attention on your content, because you're doing them with somebody else that is providing the draw for the viewer anyway. Anyway, that's the kind of advice I think that a lot of like people getting into esports now have missed, because they've missed the time when you had to do that. Like you don't have to do that anymore in order to contribute to an esports community. You can simply consume. But in the past, you couldn't really just consume, because no one else was just producing it, because they weren't getting paid to produce it. It was a community effort to produce the content and then enjoy the product of what you had created.
Yeah. Again, it just sounds so weird because if you had, just talked about this, that would have been like, oh, he's talking about like early 2000s,
Yeah,
basically,
yeah, yeah.
era.
It
Um,
really was. We were stuck in the past. We were
a
stuck in the
bit,
past.
yeah. I mean, that's what you had to do for like Brood War. You go to Team Liquid and then there'd be one guy who has access to like a 360 stream, which is slightly better than the
Yeah.
240 stream that's going on. And they would write what happened in those games because they like no one else is getting these access. And then eventually that person would get burnt out, and so you'd have to pick it up. And it was the only way to actually, as you said, like get content out there. You couldn't just sit there and consume, 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 which eventually did happen. But yeah, I'll get back to the interview part later on. But so, I mean, for you, when you are doing all these, things, oftentimes for free, I'm guessing there isn't a lot of
Yes.
payment. There isn't a lot of
No.
payment in esports earlier on. Well, how did you get the attention of Overwatch League? I vaguely recall kind of watching you something or another, maybe a video that you had done, and that's about the time that I followed you on Twitter. Because like, oh, this guy's actually pretty smart. He's good at articulating. But I'd still had only known you as like a guy who was coming in from TF2, and the Overwatch League I don't think was
Mm,
quite set in stone yet, but it was like the worst kept secret. Everyone
yeah.
knew that Blizzard was going to push their esport. But anyways, like how did someone who kind of relatively came from nowhere compared to some of the guys they drew in, right? Like Summoner was
Yeah.
one of the big ones, but then these other guys were working for ESL, doing multiple video games, and you're here just kind of like doing whatever you can find for TF2. How did you wiggle your way into the Overwatch League?
Just by try by working, by trying to learn the game as much as possible is basically the answer to that question. It's the same as what I'm doing at the moment in Valorant as well. Is that if you're actually willing to put in the effort to learn the game, most other people don't do that. I know that sounds really stupid, but a lot of people don't learn how the games work that they work in. Like, and that'll extend all the way up to like the people who are in charge of the business, or who are GMs of teams, or are producers for shows and stuff like that. Like the big thing that's lacking in my experience from working in multiple esports now is knowledge of like how the game actually functions, and how you extend storylines and stuff out of that. So my plan for getting into Overwatch was basically, I'm just going to learn this game, and I'm just going to kind of outwork the other people that are interested in getting into it. And so I did. I just watched all of the content that I could. I watched everything, all of the streams. A lot of the TF2 players were going into Overwatch at the time as well, and kind of streaming their POVs and stuff. So I was watching them. I was occasionally chatting to them to figure out, like, I don't really understand why you're picking X hero over another hero, and they'd kind of briefly sum up their thought process. Tell you what, though, as well, players are a notoriously terrible place for getting information because they intuitively understand the game, but they're normally pretty terrible at articulating those thoughts because they don't model the processes that are going on inside their head. They don't actually model the game in a conscious manner. They just intuitively understand it because they've played enough of it. Like they're like, oh yeah, Reinhardt's a great pick here. If you actually ask them to explain in detail, like why, sometimes they'll get stuck in the weeds and not be able to answer. But they know it's the right pick, but it's not always the most useful to get in touch with them. So I wouldn't say that was a major component of it. But yeah, it was just the fact that I was willing to something actually that was incredibly important in getting me into the Overwatch League was the couple of events that came beforehand. So I was working in Overwatch full time since May 2016 when the game was released. Um, at that point, I had dropped out of university. I'd actually been kicked out of university, and I was just doing article writing, basically. So I was just writing up articles on roster changes, tournament recaps, any interesting opinion pieces that I could come up with, stuff like that, and interviews with players, this kind of stuff. And so I thought, well, the best way to actually get into the scene is to know more than everybody else. And so part of that is I'm going to watch all the games and try and really think about what I'm watching and try and understand the core principles at play. But the other part is I'm going to know all the players. I'm going to know all of their player backgrounds. I'm going to know like what heroes they play, what styles they play, what the trades have been between everybody all the way back in the scene and that kind of stuff. So I was trying to amass like this database of information so that if anyone ever wanted me to go on broadcast, I would be able to tell you all about this player's niche history and somebody else's, storyline within the scene. And that level of preparation breeds confidence as well when you actually speak. It allows you to be more articulate because you don't have to worry and wonder about what you're going to say. You already know the information. You don't have to bluff it or bullshit it. Um, so I always found that incredibly helpful for being able to get in. And then the the Overwatch League just needed the Overwatch League, the Overwatch scene for some of its smaller tier 2 events needed people. And because I had been doing a combination of YouTube videos and articles about it, my name was kind of in the running from other people, knowing that I knew the players and knew the teams and knew the game. And also having been a caster in the past as well, it was just like, oh, we'll give this guy a shot and see if he's any good. And then actually from there, it's based on your performance of whether or not you are actually good.
Right, yeah. So, when did the actual Overwatch League, reach out to you? Like, how did that work out?
That was during contenders. So we had done 2017. We had, I think, 7 weeks of contenders somewhere in like July, running to September. I want to say something like that. And so I flew out to Colorado, and I was working from Colorado for 7 weeks. We were living in a hotel with a bunch of the other casters as well, and some of the more senior casting figures like Monty and Doa were giving us active advice on our. I wasn't casting at the time. Actually, Brent was casting. I was on the desk, but they were still giving us advice on presence on camera and articulating things and adding entertainment to the broadcast as well. And I was doing it with Puckett too, who then went on to be the desk host for the Overwatch League. And over the course of the 7 weeks, I just kind of we not only impressed them with what we were able to do on broadcast, but also were personable enough for them to enjoy working with us. So it was like it has to be a two-pronged approach, right? You can't just be the guy that's good on broadcast, but you're a dickhead to work with, because then no one wants to actually work with you. No one's going to recommend you. So yeah, it was a combination of both. Like I think, especially Puckett, who I worked with closely on the desk, enjoyed the knowledge that I was able to bring, but also the synergy and the banter between me and Brent particularly. So I think we got recommended as like a duo over to the Overwatch League. And that happened, I think, in like October 2017, just right at the end of Contenders, which was the first ever event in the Blizzard Arena. this finals event, first LAN event that I had done for Overwatch. No, that's not true actually, because I did the one in Germany as well. But it was the first big event with a live crowd and stuff that I had done.
Okay.
And yeah, they just got in touch with me during that and asked if I would be interested to work on the desk, which I was. I've done desk analyst work before and a bunch of other stuff, so I was happy to work in whatever capacity.
And so when you had, made this like the chemistry with Bren, did you make it, or was it experience? Did you guys talked before for
Yes, we
TF2?
he was from TF2 as well. So we had actually
Mm.
worked together since I think it was 2016. I actually reviewed Bren's first ever cast. He I was already doing casting for 2 years before that, and he was kind of um I want to say coming up in the scene, but he wasn't really coming up. He was just a player at a lower level who had been doing some casting over his team's scrims because he thought it would be fun. And so he sent the recording in to me to review, and it was pretty terrible, as all first casts are, which mine absolutely was too, 2 years earlier. And so I gave him some pointers, some stuff to work on. We worked with each other a couple of times after that. We were never like a duo, but um, after when we actually started working together a little more in the late 2016 and throughout 2017, we just developed more synergy together and just became friends, which translates through to the broadcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a bit weird though with the Overwatch League. For StarCraft, it sometimes feels like it's one of the remaining esports out there that actually doesn't bother pairing people up, which
Yeah.
I've talked to 6 different esports at this point. Like and all the big esports are pushing pairs. There's always a in mind at the very least when they start to create their leagues, which is just very different than what I was, I guess,
Mm.
experienced with. But did you actually, did they tell you that that was how it was going to be? Were you involved at all in the Overwatch League, I guess, planning, or was it really just like, hey, we got this already all figured out and you're on the list?
Yeah, they just kind of got in touch with me and said, "We're interested in having you on the desk," which was unexpected at that point. Yeah, even though I was on the way up in the Overwatch scene, I wasn't. Contenders was the first big event that I had done. So I was anticipating getting in the next year around. Like I had this career plan in my head where I was like, okay, probably missed the first wave because I didn't really get in early enough. But I'll carry on grinding. I'll do some tier two stuff, and then I'll get in 2019 instead. So I was surprised when they offered me the job in 2018. But yeah, I asked them, oh, who would I be working with? And they said Brent. And I said, Brent's never worked on an analyst desk before. And they were like, yeah, but I think he'll be fine. Like he'll pick it up. And I was like, yeah, sure. I guess that'll work. And I think for us all, it took us some time to figure out like what the dynamic should be. But I think we very much grew into it. I think there was always an idea at the beginning that everything should be very uh, straight laced and very professional feel to it. And what we figured out is it should just be way looser than that. Like the more stuffy you make it, the harder it is on yourself. Like you're putting all of this pressure on yourself to fulfill those expectations that you've only put those on yourself anyway to begin with. No one was expecting you to act stuffy and polished and suited up right from the off. So the more we loosened it up, the better it ended up being.
So in the Overwatch League, I mean, how often are you guys actually hanging out? Because I know you'd have shifts a little bit more. I know this year has been very odd, but
Yeah.
did you guys always make time to hang out with each other after the broadcast, or was it more just like a show up and work with each other and then go on home?
No, it was definitely a big group of friends, especially in the first year, but it did continue for, I mean, obviously this year has been wildly different, but it would have been a total different kind of fun this year as well for other reasons. But moving back to 2018, the first year, it was a lot of people that were moving to LA for the first time. So we didn't really have any any understanding of what there was to do, or we didn't have any pre-existing friends. There weren't other people to hang around with, so we all just hung around in a group the entire time, um, which was a great experience for me uh, to be able to have that connection of people that are friends in a new city that you can live with and share an apartment with, so you don't have to spend a ridiculous amount of money. but also you have mentorship figures there as well. Particularly in the first year, I would say Puckett and Monty were big uh, mentor kind of figures to, if you have a question about how the business side of esports works, the professionalism side, the actual craft of it at all, you can go to those guys and they will tell you like how it has been done in the past, how they believe it should be done. Plus, they come at it from totally different ways as well, which is the joy of being able to talk to so many different people that were involved in Overwatch League. They pulled people from all different sides of the sphere. So yeah, that was um, a lot of a lot of fun, honestly, to hang out with everybody, and that extended into 2019 as well. At that point, people have developed more new friendships within Los Angeles and other people to hang out with. So it wasn't so much one big conglomerate just roaming around the city tearing shit up, but it was still a pretty tight knit friend group. Now this year has been I've been locked in my apartment for 9 months and I am getting crazy, but. But it would have been fun because the original plan was to travel around from city to city, going to various different homestands, each time with a different group of people. So each time you get that same, hey, we're hanging out in, like I did one in Dallas and in Washington, and we roamed around in a big band around Washington and Dallas, just looking for stuff to do on our off days when there was rehearsal day. And then after the event was done, we're roaming around bars trying to find the best places to hang out and chill afterwards. And that was awesome. It has a different feel because you're hanging out with different people each time. But it's just a great kind of camaraderie that develops, and it's different to stuff that's like, when I hear the CS:GO casters talking about that kind of event camaraderie, it reminds me of back in TF2, where when you went to a LAN event, you weren't actually sure you were ever going to see those people again, because some of them might live on the different side of the world, some of them might not end up being players again because they might get kicked from their teams and not go to the LAN again. They might give up because the line of work isn't for them. Like there's a very different feel when you're doing one-off events repeatedly. Because I feel like you kind of have to cherish the moments as if it might be, months until you see the person again. But for the
Yeah.
Overwatch League, you know that you're working with these guys day in and day out, and so you're just like hanging out with them all the time without ever the sense that you are doing something special. It's just an awesome base layer of your life, just hanging out with people all the time.
Yeah,
It was a
that's
lot of fun.
awesome. And it's really too bad that this year happened when it did. Obviously the homesteads were going to be really fun and see how that was going to work out. And it was big for like the entire like esport world. Kind of all eyes were on Overwatch, and then whatever like got tested. And
Yes.
even us, we had a 3-year deal that started this year that was supposed to really kickstart, and it just got cut
Yeah.
off at Poland. So really disappointed about that, but it's awesome to hear that you guys actually are that close, because I feel like CS:GO. I've been to a couple of their after parties is not quite correct, but where they hang out and then
Mhm.
everyone goes. Anyways, and after after parties, they're all very friendly and they all hang out. But then I've actually peeked into their rooms. They're like talent rooms because they're like right next to each
Yeah.
other, and they're just like like someone's playing like a shooter, other person's like on their phone, and they also sometimes work in shifts as well, so they don't really. I mean, when StarCraft happens, we get there all at 8 a.m. and we all sit there and just like watch people come and go for the broadcast, and then we leave at 8 p.m. and then we
Yeah.
go and hang out with the bar at the bar. So this concept of just like not constantly being surrounded by the people that you're working with is actually obviously it works out fine, but I actually massively prefer the way that StarCraft does it, because luckily we get along, every one
Yeah.
of us, and I think
Yeah.
that's something that can be one of those like um things that you don't people aren't first to mention like, oh, it's because we don't like each other. They're like, oh no, we have shifts, and we have other
Sure.
stuff to do, but there's there's drama, there always is. Glad to hear that like Overwatch League didn't really exist either. You guys are all just a bunch of friends who like this game, who also get the pleasure of working
Yeah.
with each other multiple days out of the week.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
5 of them were living with each other this year as well. Like, that was the
yeah,
intention, to have, 5 of them living in the same house together. Just the whole idea this year was, when we're not at the homestands, we're gonna be in that house making content, like, full time. And so we were just rotating between the two. Like occasionally you would fly out and you'd be like, "Oh, hey, I haven't seen you in a while," and then you go back to the house and then you're making more content over there. The
Dang.
Yeah, it's very much been an attempt to make it uh pretty tight knit. I mean, there have also been like big changes as well in the Overwatch League when Monty Doe have left, Semler's left, Puckett's left. Like these big figures that were integral to building the project in the first place have left and made the result a lot different to what it started out being. Um, those also had a big impact because when you're hanging out with people all the time and when they have such a large creative input in all of what you're doing and what you're working on, because the Overwatch League as well is like it was quite a collaborative project in terms of the the aims of what we should be doing on the broadcast. I wouldn't say that the talent was always able to uh, have their wishes felt in the product every time, but we would have semi-regular discussions about what we wanted um, each aspect of the broadcast to look like. It wasn't just the desk click hanging out with each other and the casting clicks hanging out with each other. So when you lose those figures, you're not just losing like people that you would regularly hang out with or at least talk to. You're also losing that large creative input in the broadcast. So it changes the dynamic from a year to year more so than if you're just having sporadic events. I feel because then you're you kind of you never have that uh, kind of tight knit structure to begin with, so it doesn't feel like you've lost anything. I imagine.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point. It's kind of a weird thing I hadn't considered before. But yeah, like you're kind of assuming that like it's a year contract. I'm guessing, or sort of a year. Um, and when the person leaves, they're actually just they're mostly gone. I mean, is there an opening for Doa to come back and cast Overwatch League? Maybe, I have no idea, but that they're trying to move on. If someone were to stop casting StarCraft 2 events, they wouldn't. It's very rare for them to be like, "I'm done. I'm moving on."
Yeah,
Usually,
yeah,
kind of just like they start doing other stuff, and then if the call comes months later for the fifth event, they finally pick up the phone and say, "Actually, yeah, I want to do StarCraft event," and that's
yeah,
totally
yeah.
normal. So that is kind of weird having to almost, say like a permanent goodbye.
Yeah,
Wait,
it's more like a normal job in that sense, right? Of
yeah.
like if someone moves on, they just seem like they've simply moved on to do something
Mm.
else, and then your interactions with them extend to different esports or kind of inter esports things rather than the same thing that you were previously collaborating on creatively.
And how does that in general, like the fact that you guys have to work a year here or short of a year again, and then for instance this year you guys are gonna have rumors say anyways, you're gonna have a particularly long off season. I mean, how does that work out as far as how you view this career, right? Because Overwatch League is as far as compared to other esports, a little less on the freelance side, more like, okay, if I sign on, I've got a certain amount of time to work here. But then suddenly there's like huge gaps in work.
Yeah.
I mean, how much do you make sure that you're out there putting your name out for other esports? Is it something that you actively try to do, or only when an esport arrives that you're interested in? Do you worry about your return to Overwatch League if you get too involved in this other esport?
Yeah, it's a weird situation. I mean, when I signed in 2018, um, I didn't know that I would be brought back for 2019, and I thought the same when I was signed in 2019 as well. Um, each year that you sign, you know more about the direction of the company, and you know more about the longevity of the product. You know more about your negotiating power and your position to be re-signed in the future as well. So you get more and more confident about that. But because you never know for sure, and because it makes up such a large portion of your revenue for the year, it becomes a major issue if at the end of the year they were like, "Oh, actually, no, we don't want to work with you." So when we first signed in 2018, me and Brent particularly decided that we weren't going to make any large investments in living in LA in case they decided to drop us at the end of the year and we had to move back to the UK. Um, we only had a 1 year visa. So if they weren't going to pick it up, we weren't returning to Los Angeles. We would certainly weren't living there. And so large expenditures like a sofa or a bed seemed unreasonable. And so we lived for 5 months on an air mattress. I don't want to say that as if me and Bren were sharing an air mattress. We did buy one each. We were able to rationalize that. But yeah, we were really locked into this thought. Also, it was rationalizing laziness, let's be real. But we really did have this idea in our heads of like making the living situation reflect the temporary nature of the contract and not wanting to permanently set up roots in LA when we didn't know how long we would be involved in the Overwatch League for. Um, and that's obviously lessened now. I mean, I have a long term partner here. I do have a bed. I bought a bed fairly early on in 2018, but yeah, and now I have major roots in LA after living here for 3 years. But the um the 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 status of the work is always an interesting situation because you have the safety net of the Overwatch League, which is something that a lot of other freelance people really lack in esports. The I have absolutely no problems with the compensation that I've ever received from Blizzard because it makes up for the fact that the off season is the off season, that you don't really have too much work in there. The I'm never scrimping at the end of the year because that is accounted for. Like they understand that if you commit to the Overwatch League for a year, you are essentially committing to Overwatch for the year. Because if you want to simultaneously learn another esport to be able to dabble in it in the off season, I mean, you can only reasonably do that if you are doing a role where you don't need in-depth knowledge of a game. If you're trying to do interviewing or desk hosting, or maybe you could scrape play by play if you also play the game really heavily on the side as well, something like that. But if you're trying to get a job as like a color caster or an analyst, which were my primary positions if I'm going to dabble in another esport, in order to put the time in to actually learn another esport like I'm currently doing with Valorant, it is silly. It is absolutely ridiculous kind of time investment to do that. At least to the level that I would actually want to do it, to not half-ass it is truly ridiculous. So that has always been reflected in the compensation. So I've never really felt like I have to really actively fill the off season in order to survive. That's never been like a major motivation for me. But things like fleshing out a YouTube channel, fleshing out a Twitch channel, creating these other streams of revenue are always good things to do at the same time. They increase brand awareness, they put your image out to different places, you're actually creating more content and putting it out in the world in order to get more eyes on you, and you can translate that into sponsorship deals or just the primary revenue that comes through YouTube and Twitch too. So those have been my primary outside sources of revenue at the same time as working on the Overwatch League because they have other benefits as well, other than purely the money side of it too. Um, but the yeah, the system actually I quite like. Like I think that I think the way that the Overwatch League works, where it has the safety net of the contract every year, plus you have this off season to be able to do some stuff in. I think it's set up pretty nicely. Definitely for somebody that's just getting into esports, I never really had to worry about the freelance. I don't know where my next gig is because the Overwatch League is a very structured circuit. You know that there is Overwatch League off season, Overwatch League off season. It's not, oh, is there going to be an IEM or an MLG around the corner? We don't know. Who's the talent for it? We don't know. All of those fears I've bypassed completely in my career. And now I've got to the point where I've had 3 years of a safety net. I've set up enough alternate revenue streams that I don't have to worry about that too much in the future. So I would consider myself very lucky to have got onto this pathway of esports instead of the other.
Oh yeah, I think most people were jealous of the setup of Overwatch League. I mean, I can see where it could be a little bit of a double-edged sword. The idea that like, yeah, there isn't much room to play around with other options. Should you for whatever reason start to fear that
Yeah,
next year is not going to get you a contract, but overall, especially once you've built that brand and you've I think cemented yourself in the community, like you have done, or like Uber or Mr. X has done, like it's not really the fear of losing that contract as much as it is maybe just a desire to try other things. Could be limited because Overwatch
yeah,
League does have a lot of things to ask, but I'm glad to hear that they're compensating you correctly for it. Um, that's I'd say definitely a worry, I suppose. As always, is like where is the esports who was pushing it more to what we always talk about, or some of us talk about, is like, man, what if we could push it to the NFL commentators, the basketball commentators, that type of cash rolling in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't
And
know about that, but it's not bad.
yeah, it's not bad, yeah. But on the flip side though, is like who is regressing, who is like
Sure.
not ever pushing it and never asking for anything more. That's good to hear. So I really like you were talking about with the brand and just like the maybe tinier things that you can do instead of just completely jumping onto a second esport, pushing that YouTube, pushing some shows, pushing that Twitch channel, all fantastic stuff. And I know that you've been particularly good at it. Been following some of your adventures, the PlatChat and all that. It's
Yes,
very
yeah.
fun to watch. And I interviewed Uber a couple of weeks ago, and he even mentioned you in the podcast where he was like, there's ways here that you can push your branding and what the community views you as. And he said that you and Brandon did a fantastic job of doing these kind of silly things, and these
Yeah.
extreme things sometimes that have really pushed your brand so that you very quickly went from like oh, I don't know them as a commentator duo, because that changed this year for the guys that
Yeah.
listen to this podcast, to okay, well, we got to have them back next year. They did a fantastic job. So, for example, again, guys out there, you don't know, shaving your eyebrows off like that
Yes.
was pretty
Yeah, yeah.
extreme,
Yeah, that
but
is quite
everyone
extreme.
knows you did it. And you were on the talk of the subreddits, and everyone was making jokes at your expense, but that just meant that your name was being talked more about than anyone else. So
Yeah, I mean,
uh
I don't wanna say it was a purely cynical thing that I did in order for the clout. I did I think it came from Puckett coming into my channel and saying but Puckett's an absolute troll. He'll keep popping up in my Twitch channel while I'm streaming. I was just streaming a random Overwatch game. In fact, I remember it was on Hanamura, and he comes into my channel and he says, "How much?" I don't know where he got this idea from, but he said, how many subs would it take for you to shave off your eyebrow? And I really thought it was just a hypothetical, but because me and so there is a bit of context to this as well. It wasn't just totally random. We when I was in college, we would play a game called Eyebrow, where if you make a claim, like for example, we would do it whilst playing FIFA a lot, but it extended throughout the whole of the rest of our lives together. Where me and my college friends, if you made a claim like, "Oh, mate, I'm gonna beat you. I'm gonna beat you easily in FIFA," this next game 5-0. Watch this, something like that, where you're claiming that you will do something. If the other person says eyebrow, if you fail to live up to that claim, you get a slit shaven out of your eyebrow. So we played this game also in contenders because I thought it was just a bit of banter. So we played it in contenders as well and had obviously everyone's working on broadcast, so they can't shave their eyebrows while on broadcast. But we saved them up until the end of contenders. This was the end of 2017. I don't know where I don't know where I got the blind confidence to just suggest that these esports veterans should start shaving their body for me. But I we were playing this game, and at the end of it, we went to a bar and we got out a bunch of waxing strips, and we were just like, instead of taking slices out of eyebrows, we were just waxing people's big strips of people's legs for each one that they had claimed throughout the season. And so I think this idea had then inspired this bet in Puckett's mind, where he came into my Twitch chat and said, how many subs would it take for you to shave off your eyebrows? And I thought it was just a hypothetical. So I said a number that I believed was ludicrous. Like, I think I was sat at something like 800 subs, something like that, maybe even lower. And I said, oh, 2,000. Because I'd never been close to 1,000 subs while streaming on YouTube, while streaming on Twitch, sorry. And so I was like, oh, 2,000 subs. And for some reason, that kind of claims stuck in the brain of everyone in my Twitch chat, and they just went and exploded with it. Like these sometimes these silly ideas just take hold, and that one just took a life of its own, and so people just exploded with it. And at some point, I was like, "Whoa, this is gonna make me a lot of money," and then I was like, "Oh fuck, this is actually gonna have 4 months where I have literally zero eyebrows." I'll tell you what, it was not worth it. I would never do it again. It was absolutely not worth it. You look alien without eyebrows.
You do, yeah. I was trying to do some like the math in my head. I guess you didn't, but I was like, let's say you get like 1,500 subs to reach that goal. I mean, that's like 3,000, $4,000.
Yeah, it's
Like,
really not much. It's like it's not
it's not
enough.
that much. Yeah, exactly. It's not enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, I get the same thing, like one of the co-casters I have, Fear Dragon, bets me to do like these terrible, stupid things. And I'm like 5,000 subs is usually my
Yeah, yeah,
answer.
exactly. Yeah,
That might
now
be enough money.
yeah, 7 billion.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what
Yeah.
I'm gonna go for next time. I mean, if you're gonna get paid, get paid. Don't
Right.
don't do it for a paltry amount.
But it also stuck out for the community, right? But that was,
Yes.
on top of you doing a lot of other things, being involved in a lot of shows, being very out there basically. You would stream and then talk about like an Overwatch match that was happening or just happened, as side along streams.
Yes. Yeah, I did the
Yeah,
companion streams. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
but also that one came out of necessity as well. But well, kind of. Because I got stuck in a visa situation in the beginning of 2019 where I wasn't able to return back to LA because there was like some claim for additional information on my visa application, and so it took longer than expected. And I ended up being stuck in the UK until I think it was like March. I think it was like 19th of March or something. I go back into LA, and the Overwatch League, generally speaking, in 2018 and 2019 and 2020 began in, I think it's like early February. It might even be late January. So I missed an entire month of the broadcast, basically. I missed the whole first stage, the whole first quarter of the year. And so I was just trying to think, like, what should I do in the meantime? I mean, I'm going to be watching the games anyway because I have to watch the games. That's my job, is to know about the games. I can't just take a quarter of the year off because then I have to catch up on it all when I go to LA. So when I kind of was walking down that path mentally, I thought about something that the CS commentators had done in the past, where they had done a companion stream, a co-stream for one of the events. So the people that hadn't been signed had actually flown out. The people that hadn't been signed, I think for a major, had instead flown out to a studio in Sweden, I think it was, and they had done a live broadcast from there where it was just a bunch of people bantering about the match that was happening. And it was a much more casual, chill environment that combined some comedy stuff with some actual analysis that is either too dry or too specific to get into when you're live broadcasting a game. You have to keep up with the flow of a game when you're doing the casting. And the desk only has a very small amount of time to talk about it. But if you're doing a companion stream, a co-stream at the same time, you can pick out a cool moment from a round and you can talk about that throughout the next two rounds. Because you don't really give a shit. Like if someone cares about those next two rounds, they can tune into the main broadcast if they want. I'm going on a tangent here. You can be a bit more self-indulgent in that sense. So I really liked that idea. The CS guys had said that it never really worked out feasibly to do a live broadcast. The money just didn't add up, and the TOs weren't willing to support it. But I thought it was a cool idea, and I wasn't even aware that people like Joe Rogan do them for the fight nights and stuff like that. I just thought, oh, this is a cool idea that the CS guys have tried out. Maybe I should try that, and it ended up popping off. It was a really popular thing in Overwatch as well. And now it's actually mega common across all the scenes now too. There's a bunch of people doing it in Valorant. It was a massive thing in Fortnite as well. Pretty much the exact same year that I started it, a bunch of people were, big content creators were doing a similar thing over in Fortnite too. And yeah, various different regions have and various different games have all taken this idea as an alternate way of broadcasting.
Yeah, well, it worked out very well, as you said. I mean, a lot of these things kind of just sound like you thought it was a fun idea, a good idea, and you just did it. Which
Yeah,
actually is a major problem for a lot of people, I mean, myself included, to be honest. But we start talking about like, again, going back to the very first conversation of this podcast, it was like, just do something, just do whatever, just do it. It usually like people want to hype it up, they want to get validation on if something's a good idea. So we see those tweets to the people that clearly are going to say yes, it's a good idea because you're tweeting
sure.
people that
Yeah, yeah,
follow you, and you really should just like do stuff.
yeah.
And then if
I
it pops off, great. If it doesn't, then you try something else.
That's the thing. You have to throw ideas out there into the world to see which ones pop. So, like from the stuff that I've done, we had a number of shows that we started. So, PlatChat we started, which is this Overwatch podcast that discusses a bunch of stuff that's happening in Overwatch, and then specifically competitive Overwatch in the Overwatch League too. That was mega popular, but it took a while over time. But we knew it was going to be popular, so we just stuck with it, and then launched the Valorant version of it recently as well, which I hope is also going to be popular. I think it is. That I've got a bunch of like the players are fans of it, which is how you know that you're producing pretty decent content as well if the players themselves are enjoying watching. It's not just platitudes and nonsense. Um, but then also we had the Foreheads podcast, which was a pet project of ours, which was a more like comedy, um, general podcast. The problem is it never really had a vision, and we haven't done one in weeks at this point because I think it naturally tapered off a little bit. Like we realized it wasn't going anywhere huge, and so it was one of those ideas that we threw into the void. We worked on it for months, and now we've realized that it doesn't really have the best future in the world. It's not. I'm not saying that it's done forever, but it's not a priority for us compared to other content that we're working on. And that isn't something that we've ever vocalized. We just all realized simultaneously this isn't a priority, and we've kind of tapered it off over time. We have another D&D show called Casters and Castles that never really popped off in the same kind of way either. But we're kind of low key running it at the same time, and it's got a couple of different people, different opportunities as well within that tabletop RPG kind of sphere too. So it's about just doing stuff and seeing what works, and then not committing yourself to projects if they're not performing, to go back and reevaluate, like, okay, why did this work, why didn't this work, what can I do to change the direction of it and ensure that it works in the future too. A quote that I always think of when it comes to this kind of stuff is the perfect is the enemy of the good. Like if you're trying to make something perfect, you are fucking up something that could be good. Like you can just put out good content all the time if you have a good mind for it, and you'll slowly iterate over time to make it better and better. But if you really try and make your first project perfect, you will never do them. You'll actually
Yeah.
just never get around to doing them. And if you do get around to doing them, they'll have taken up so much of your time that if it fails, you'll feel like it's a complete disaster. And you could have been working on 3 different projects that were all good in the meantime that you could slowly iterate on and allocate time based on their success. And trying to make perfect things is nonsense, especially in a sphere like esports where the standards are so low. The standards for content in esports and gaming are just on the floor. They genuinely are. Like some of the broadcasts that I see, terrible production quality, terrible all sorts of stuff, still got people watching. Some of the streams that you watch, like the biggest streamers, have the worst production quality. And yet all the streamers trying to come up are focused on like what their overlay looks like and making sure they have the perfect announcements that pop up on screen. Like people focus on the details, and it's not about the details. It's about the big picture, about the
Yeah.
entertainment, about the stuff that actually draws people in.
Yeah, it's also kind of like the busy work aspect. There's a guy I follow on YouTube who's like he does all like the correct YouTube things, so people might think he's a bit of a sellout or whatever it is, right? But
Hmm.
he actually had some pretty good things to say about this. And oh shoot, what was it? I've lost it. I had two quotes in mind, and I lost the first one I
You
had.
said busy work. Was it
Oh,
related?
thank you. Yes, busy work, and that people like will put in 8 hours of streaming, and they'll be like, I work really hard because I do that, and then they won't improve at all, right? Because
Mm,
basically they do these things that are supposed to net them gains because that's the general advice, but actually it is just like it is a type of working hard, but it's not working very smart. So you go around saying I'm a hard worker, and it's like, well, what does that like amount it to? And it's like, oh well, I can say I'm a hard worker, and it's like, well, that's great, but maybe you should have been looking at different avenues. And starting up projects and refreshing projects is all part of doing it kind of I think in a smarter way. And the other thing I wanted to say is like that was a very good quote from you, but then there's also the quote that what is it? Like anything worth doing is worth doing right is a very old fashioned quote, but someone recently dared to say that that was quite incorrect. Anything worth doing is worth doing is actually like that is the quote. Like you don't
yeah.
have to do it super right. You can do it wrong and be like okay with it and learn from it, which has been really difficult. Especially I think as the content, like it's funny, there is a lot of content, like you're absolutely right. Like some of the big streamers have the worst mics and no camera and no overlay. And obviously that happens, but there is still a lot of content that people look at and they get all, starry eyed, and they look at like their favorite guys, their favorite productions, and it looks so crisp. So they're like, I
Yes.
gotta have something that compared to that. And it's not usually the case, but of course, showing that you're putting in work to it can be good, but
Yeah.
it's a difficult balancing act.
It is. It is. But I think what it comes down to as well is just you need you need a starting place. Like
Yeah.
the quote that you said about if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right is great if it applies to like mending a hole in a roof. Like, something that where you're doing it and it's a one-time job and it's got to be done well. But when it comes to creating video content or casting or something like that, you're not you're not putting you're not creating one piece of work to be treasured forever. No one does that with any video content that they put out anywhere. Aside of like very specific YouTube channels that are trying to put out one piece a month that's beautiful, that is not generally how people are starting. That's not generally how people are making content. It's not one piece of work that you put on a mantelpiece. It is a series of work that you are putting out into the world, which means it's an iterative process, which means you need a starting point and you need to iterate and get better and better and better as it goes, which means that starting point doesn't have to be good at all. It can just be good enough to get you the experience to keep improving on it afterwards. It's less a hole in a roof and more of it's a series of videos. That's
Yeah,
what it
well,
is.
I mean, it's soft skills, right? Like things that don't
Yeah.
really have like a start point and an end point. It's just like something that you build off of, which you can bring it back to casting. Like that's just kind of like a whole idea of just getting started. Body in motion stays in motion. Same for like a
Yeah.
mind in motion. Just doing it. But it is hard when you, especially, to relate it to transferring over to other esports here. So, if I was, I want to cast other esports because I want to give it to go. I want to have some fun, but my initial barrier has always been like, well, I've made it this far in StarCraft 2. I mean, I like if I can't go 1-to-1 to this other game and just suddenly be like the top tier caster over there because it's just, I'm not going to be able to do it. But that expectation is very hard for me to, admit. So I
Sure.
got to go back to what it was years and years ago, where you just cast something for fun on your YouTube, and if it was fun, keep doing it. If it eventually gets a couple of people saying that it's actually pretty decent, maybe look into it, maybe not. But it's that is where I think you have to get started. And for you, you say that as you look into Valorant, you are putting in tons of work. It's going to be a very difficult scene to break into since it has so much of that background of being supported by Riot and
Yeah.
modeling the most popular esport. And uh, do you have that certain expectation for yourself, and you're putting in a lot of the back end, the work that's not seen, or are you also kind of approaching this as something that like if it works out, it works out, or is this actually something where you've written out your plan? You have like a
Yeah, I
step by
mean,
step process.
I haven't really written it out, but I have the same mental plan that I had when I was coming into Overwatch, which is essentially it's a brand new game. I know that it maintains a lot of the similarities to CS:GO, but the way that the game is approached strategically in terms of the abilities, it changes the game to a level where you can't just be a CS expert and come in and understand everything about Valorant. The game's different, the maps are different, the abilities change the game fundamentally. And so you're on a level playing field with most people. When the game is released, it's a race to get good. And if you're willing to put in the additional time, you can get good faster than everybody else can get good. That's the same that happened with Overwatch in 2016 as well. And so that's one of the situations where um, I do put the expectations on myself to be good at it, because if I'm not better than almost everybody else that's doing it, I am either not thinking about it properly or I'm not putting in the work properly. Like those are the only two explanations for why I wouldn't be able to do it. Because there's no I don't really believe that like having a CS background is a big enough advantage that I wouldn't be able to overwork it by just putting in the hours. So the my thought process coming into Valorant is basically that if I watch all of the games and study all of the footage and do that simultaneously with Overwatch, which it's in the off season at the moment, so there isn't that much footage to actually be watching at the moment, then there's no reason why I couldn't be the same level that I am in Overwatch in Valorant immediately. Um, so that's kind of been my driving factor for doing a lot of Valorant work recently, is the idea that every time a new title is released, one that is fundamentally different to other titles, if when Overwatch 2 releases, presumably it's going to be pretty similar to Overwatch. And so you would expect the people that are at the top level in Overwatch in terms of players and casters and stuff like that are going to have an easier transition than someone who came from Counter-Strike, for example. But Valorant is fundamentally different enough that it creates a fairly level playing field to go for, which was the benefit of getting in early in Overwatch as well. And that's what I also recommend to people who are trying to get into an esport at the beginning too, is to try and ride that wave at the beginning. Because if you're trying to play catch up to everybody else, like if someone tries to come in now to Valorant, they have to catch up to like the 6 months of VODs that I've already been watching and like the knowledge that I've already been accruing. And the same for everybody else. Like if you're trying to catch up to being a player, you have to catch up to all of those players that have spent 6 months playing the game and learning the game and learning how different abilities interact and developing their protocols and all sorts of different stuff. So the catch up game is always more difficult. But if you get in on the ground floor and you're playing that race with everybody else, the race to get good, the race to learn, then you can at least remain competitive, if not stay ahead of everyone else, and uh, try and maintain that position. It's always easier to maintain than to play catch up afterwards.
I mean, it still sounds quite stressful because a lot of these times, I mean, you did have the opportunity with Overwatch League to come in alongside a lot of guys coming in from different esports that had already built a brand, and it worked out fantastic. But it is quite stressful when you go into any new esport and it turns out that Golden Boy and Rivington the Third and whoever else is doing the recent Valorant, is doing Valorant. That like even though Rivington is a League of Legends caster, I mean, he came into Valorant and did a decent enough job that they actually hired him. I mean, does it ever feel like it's out of your control? Because right now what it sounds like is that you actually have a very good drive. You're like psychologically well set up to do this, which is that if I do everything that I have set out to do, I am in control of my own destiny. But it can be a
Yeah,
little difficult for people, especially those who don't have any clout in any esport. They are really coming from nothing. To look at all these humongously big names and be like, I can beat that guy, instead of saying, "Well, I might not beat him now, but maybe he'll move on to something else later, and then
yeah,
I can come up."
yeah. And if you remember back to what I was saying about Overwatch, I wasn't expecting to get into the first wave of Overwatch, even though I had the same mentality. So I had the same mentality of I'm going to try and outgrind everyone. I'm really going to try and work and develop all of my knowledge about all of the players and how the game works, etc., etc. But I still wasn't expecting to actually get in on the ground floor. I was just trying to continue that over time to get some kind of position, whatever that position might be, that would be sustainable for me for the future. So it and I've talked to a bunch of the upcoming casters in Valorant as well. I've been doing a lot of Valorant VOD reviews at the moment because currently I'm in an exclusive contract for the Overwatch League, so I can't work Valorant even if I was offered gigs, I literally can't. So I find that puts me in a pretty good position to give these upcoming casters tips because they know that I'm not trying to fuck them over. I'm not trying to steal their gigs. I can actually try and elevate the level of casting because I'm just coming at it from a viewer. Like I'm watching these tournaments. I want the casters to get better, so that it increases my enjoyment of watching the tournaments. So I've done a lot of talk with them as well, and something that I spoke to the most recent one about is that a very very small percentage of them will actually make it, and they have to be aware of that fact, aware that there's a lot of luck involved in that, of being in the right place at the right time as well. But you can't change the luck aspect. There's nothing you can do about that. But what you can do is you can maximize your chances massively of actually being the first choice out of those tier 2 people if one of them does get selected for, say League of Legends went franchised instead of giving the giving the power to tournament organizers to select talent. Because at the moment for next year, the tournament organizers are selecting different pieces of talent for the Valorant Champions Tour. But say it went franchise and Riot got to pick everybody, you want to work yourself up to the as high on the list as possible so that there's a higher chance of you actually being selected. So that is as much as is possible for it to be in your control, you should try and maximize that. Like it's kind of the there definitely is a huge amount of luck and survivorship bias that plays into it here as well, where the people who have made it are going to give you advice on how to make it, even though their advice might not be true. It's like a person who won the lottery ticket telling you to go, oh yeah, go buy lottery tickets. But some part of the process is manipulable. Like you can actually determine at least a percentage of your fate. And so that's my point of view, is that I want to make that as high as possible. And I've seen it work before. Like I feel like it would be especially once you gain some footing to then work off, like you have some level of reputation, you have some previous body of work to springboard off of, it becomes easier and easier. So the from my point of view, I feel pretty confident about being able to get into any future esport that I put my time into. Um, but for people who are coming up from the ground floor, I think the best thing that you can do is put as much effort in as you can to increase your likelihood as much as possible and realize that it is a long term grind and be open to as many different avenues of work as possible, too. Because, like I said, when I was getting into Overwatch, I was down to do anything. I was doing journalism, article writing. I wasn't doing events management, but that's something that I'd done in TF2 before, casting, analyzing, uh, uh, a bunch of different stuff. I would have gone into a bunch of behind the scenes job in Overwatch League as well if I hadn't been offered the on camera position. So I think just being open to like attempting to influence your destiny as much as possible, but then being open to the opportunities that present themselves and not kind of locking yourself into one of them um, is is the best way of approaching that kind of thing.
Absolutely. It's just hard to tell yourself that every day, right? To approach it from that angle.
Yeah,
It
and
actually
some
takes
people
some
aren't
effort.
financially able to do that either.
Yeah.
Like some people don't have the privilege that I did of being able to live with my family when I was earning like 5,000 quid a year working writing articles in Overwatch, with them telling me constantly, "Have you been applying for jobs recently?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, don't worry, I'm definitely applying for jobs, mum, definitely applying for jobs." Meanwhile, writing another article about a roster move that's been happening in Overwatch. How are you paying the rent that we were asking you for? Oh, yeah, yeah, don't worry, I've got some side revenue streams. Definitely still applying for jobs though. So yeah, it's like the timing aspect of it was very fortuitous for me in that I was able to sustain myself financially during that period of time. Um, but I think if you're just trying to do one esport, if you're really just trying to make it in one esport, that is possible with most full-time jobs that you would be able to do. Like as long as you don't have a massive amount of other things that you're also very much into, like some major sports hobby or major
Have like
something
a
else that takes
family.
up a lot of your time. Yeah, family or a social life for sure. But if you're really like the job aspect of it, you can do that at the same time. There have been players and coaches and other things that have been able to juggle both, but obviously there are sacrifices um, when stuff like that occurs.
Yeah, for sure. It is difficult. I was in the same boat towards the beginning of StarCraft 2. I was working. I wasn't working rather. I was a kid, college, and then staying at home. So it was really fortuitous. So were you going out to like meeting up with people who were clearly going to be involved in the Overwatch League, or you were getting reaching out to people who were involved with Blizzard to kind of offer up your services, or were you really was this all just like word of mouth?
Yeah, it was all just word of mouth. I don't know how one would even get in touch with a developer to say that you want to work their game. Is there an email that you would go to? I don't know how that would even happen. Like, as far as I'm aware, the selection processes for these kind of things tend to be recommendations from either the people that are running the esports side of the. So the developer kind of hires somebody that's in charge of their esports department. They have a talent manager who is either aware of people in the scene and asks you if you're interested, or they'll ask the other talent that they already know, who would you recommend, or they'll spot your name in terms of a YouTube video that you've made will pop off on Reddit or something, or there's normally a way that you get noticed, and it's them approaching you. At least that's how it always has been with me, um, throughout everything that I've done. So I don't even know whether there is another way of doing it, but that's
um,
how I've done it.
Yeah, I don't know about reaching out to someone like, you wouldn't know who the talent manager is. I doubt it
Yeah, I mean,
anyways. But as far as reaching out to people that you know are getting involved with something, so for instance, for something like Valorant, if you knew that Golden Boy was going to be
mm,
reached out to, perhaps being like, obviously you can't just be like, hey, I heard you're doing this thing, give me a job. But you could be like, hey, you're getting into Valorant, like I'm getting into Valorant, best of luck. I hope to see you in the future event, right? Something like that, just to have your name out there.
sure,
People have told me that they've made efforts to make sure that they are on the minds of the people working an event for the future. and then we get into a
Yeah.
talk about the balancing act of being the guy who's clearly looking for a job just to pay the bills, and a guy who's
Yeah.
actually being cool and just looking for opportunities. It's
Yeah, I've never
I
I've never done that particularly, and I think I would personally I don't think that's a bad thing to do, but I would personally feel uncomfortable doing that
mm.
because I'm British and my emotions are very repressed, and so I feel rude infringing on people in that kind of way because I feel like it would be very transparent what I was attempting to do. So instead, my approach with it has always been I will be on the minds of the people selecting it through the work that I produce. Like if I'm out here streaming constantly and doing interviews with players, and then the players know that I'm doing content, or we have PlatChat Valorant that we're doing, or stuff like that, through the work, they will understand that I am interested in the scene when it comes to Overwatch or Valorant. Same stuff that I did at the beginning of Overwatch. I was writing articles about the players. I was doing interviews with all the players. A bunch of the players were from TF2 as well, so they knew that I was interested in the scene. I flew out to some of the events in order to do live interviews for uh, some of the very first LAN events that were happening in Overwatch. And so I did some interviews with the players, but also the casters as well. And so they knew that I was interested in doing that kind of stuff. I built the relationships that way rather than actually directly reaching out and trying to have a subtle conversation with them. That's not something I'm very good at. So instead, I would rather
Of
like
course, yeah.
engage them in work.
Yeah, but that is more so what I think it would happen, right? Like, the whole idea of flying out to an event when you could, to actually converse with people and be cool and be known as someone who's not being super needy and super obnoxious, and then
Yeah.
actually doing more collaborative work with them, and then
Yes.
clearly showing that you're going to put in the effort, but also showing like, yes, if you think I did a good job, if you could suggest me, that'd be great, without having to say so super directly.
Yes.
Obviously is the best way to do it. um so when you talk a lot about a lot of this has been about content, which is a fantastic angle that hasn't
Hmm.
really been approached quite yet on this podcast, that it is really content driven, and then eventually they'll find you and be like, this job fits you according to us, and that's great.
Yeah.
You've managed to show them 7 jobs you could do and they picked you for 1.
Yeah.
Well, how much do you actually think for the commentating portion is based off your actual commentary skill, your ability to talk, basically? Because a lot of what we've been talking about is knowing the players, knowing the scene,
Mm.
knowing the history, and that's all very important for story building, which is really the most important thing about commentary. But you also want to be able to articulate
Yes.
and inform sentences with words. How
Yeah.
much of that actually do you think is, if you could scale it, if you could weigh it here, percentages, how much is that important?
I'm not sure. I think it's very difficult to say because the the people that are hiring um the people that are hiring very often don't know the game particularly well, and they don't this is a big generalization, but I also think that the majority of the people that hire for esports really don't know commentary that well either. Like it seems like when you look across the sphere in esports, there's a lot of people that um that don't seem to hire based on who the best people actually are, or they have a weird view of what good commentary actually is, which I'm not. Yeah, it's a weird comment to make, perhaps. But what I mean by this is that it doesn't necessarily matter if you attain excellence in either sphere. It's more to do with, I think, your charisma and how you are perceived on the broadcast as to whether or not people will actually hire you for future broadcasts. For example, to take the worst example of this, if you knew everything about every player, but you have no level of charisma or personality whatsoever when it comes to being on camera, you can't make eye contact with the camera, you're really shy, and you're just kind of mumbling out all of your words. The content of what you're speaking is still excellent. Like if you presented that in a very personable way, you would be a fantastic commentator. But by missing out on all of the on-camera skills, you are never going to get picked up. Never. Because those are the most obvious things to be able to tell in another person. If you have no idea about the game, if you're just some suit that's been hired to hire other people, you're immediately going to know, well, that guy doesn't work on camera. Holy moly. Don't hire him again. But on the flip side of that, if you have a lot of charisma, but you know nothing about the game and you're just pure bullshitting, a lot of that will go over people's head. Like a lot of that you won't even they won't even realize. And so you've got this um, weird system where you absolutely need the charisma and the on-camera abilities to be able to ever get hired for an event, because otherwise people will just literally strike your name off the list. But in order to actually progress up the list and have longevity within the esport, you need to focus on the knowledge and the skills, and the commentary skills and the craft side of it in order to actually get better and continue to get events. But that foot in the door, the door will get slammed in your face if you do not have the necessary skills to even make a good first impression on the broadcast. Which, I mean, again, another little piece of luck there as well. TF2 was so tiny that when I had none of that charisma skill and talent on broadcast, I think my first cast ever, like I was so nervous casting to like 400 people that my teeth were chattering. And like, I don't know how that came across. I sounded terrible. So like, it sounded like I had absolutely no on camera charisma. But because it was so small, I was able to iterate on that and continue to get work later on. So if you don't have that necessary skill to be able to do the work at the beginning, that's 100% what you need to focus on in order to actually get good at it. And the other stuff can come later, because that's the kind of stuff that you can't get away with. You can't kind of bullshit your way around not being uh charismatic. But you can learn it. You absolutely can learn charisma and confidence. Like, it's totally a thing that you can learn. A lot of the stuff that people assume are just base personality traits are definitely learnable if you put in the time and the effort. And definitely charisma and on-camera confidence is definitely one of them.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories, especially in esports, when most people are saying that they're nerds, that they didn't speak, they didn't do public speaking in school, the typical shy thing, and
Yeah.
then they're the ones who are now up on stage in front of millions and whatnot. So it's absolutely a learnable skill, but it's still a soft skill though, and it's it's very difficult to find a teacher for it. There actually are though. I feel like I bring this up occasionally. There's teachers for on camera presence that they teach like news anchors what to do. There's teachers for your voice that aren't just about singing.
Yes.
They teach people when they go up on a stage to speak, and that's pretty much what we're doing, even if it's slightly different. They're available, but this goes back to actually being in a good financial state. But if that was something that was
There's
truly
also
being a barrier, then I would
There's also a
suggest
lot
looking
of
into it.
voice coaching stuff on YouTube as well.
Oh
It's
yeah,
something that I looked up recently because I was doing some Valorant coaching for some upcoming talent. And one of the people that I was doing some coaching for has like a voice that isn't really suited for broadcast. It's a bit too hyponasal. Not too hyponasal, but it's more of that kind of voice. And the way I always feel bad when I talk about this kind of stuff though, because I don't dislike the voice and I don't dislike a bunch of different stuff, but the public perception is always what you're battling against whenever you do on-camera stuff. The comedians call it their persona as well. Like, you have to match your material to your persona, because otherwise people will not understand what you're putting forwards. Like, they have a certain prejudice and an expectation of what broadcasters should sound like and what people on camera should look and act like as well. And if you fail to match those expectations or meet them in any way, then they will actively not like you as much. And so you're constantly battling against that, which is why I'm talking about like the voice not being suited. It's not because I personally disliked it, but when I said that to him, I said there's a bunch of different voice coaches on YouTube that you can try and use what they're putting out there. It's obviously not going to be quite as good as having a personal voice coach, but it is also free compared to being multiple hundreds of dollars.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. A lot of voice acting and voice coaches are going to tell you that there's always like a good voice within everyone. It's a process of finding it. A lot of those voices that are actually very grating, they're somewhat natural.
Yeah.
It's not the best voice. It's not a voice, the golden voice, sure, but it's also a voice that has been taught, very bad practices. And once they kind of mold it a little bit more, it's actually very doable.
Yes.
I don't want to name any names, but I think there are people out there who are being paid to cast that don't actually have a golden voice. I think
Sure. Sure.
we could easily argue that a lot of people don't actually when we think of like James Earl Jones, right, as like a golden voice. Like,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
can't think of anyone who has that, but but people work with it and, eventually get start getting complimented on their voice even when even when someone actually means what they are saying is like, "I like how you use your voice. I like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
way you go up and down and short and long phrases and things like that." So definitely, something to look into. So you've actually been coaching some of these guys, in Valorant, which is very interesting. I know Uber's also been doing some, like, on-stream coaching as well.
Mm.
Is this just like a side gig that Overwatch League guys are doing, or is it just particularly you
Yeah.
2?
Well, like I said, I can't actually work at the moment for Valorant, and so it's just a cool way of contributing to the scene in some way as well, and kind of elevating the tier 2 level as well. Um, there's a lot of people trying to get into Valorant that I see similarities to what I was trying to do when I was working there as well, and just providing them with some direction and some advice and um yeah, working with them to try and improve my enjoyment of the broadcast as well. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to be watching these guys and listening to these guys too. So if I can help them get better, it's going to benefit me too because I'm going to enjoy it more afterwards. So yeah, that's. I haven't done a ton of it. I've done a couple. I think I did one in Overwatch recently, and then I did 3 or 4 in Valorant, just because I had some spare time to work with, and I thought it'd be a cool thing to do. And also, a lot of the people getting into casting in Valorant are brand new casters as well that don't understand the business side of it either. So the rate situation was all sorts of fucked up over there too. And yeah, it's difficult to know your value and how to get better and how to communicate with tournament organizers and talk to your other casters about important things. The kind of stuff that I've learned over the last 3 4 years is just what I've tried to pass on because that's what happened to me. I had that kind of mentorship process when I joined the Overwatch League, and so I feel it's only right to pass those kind of things on.
And so are they reaching out to you, or are you DMing them and being like, "Hey, do you want feedback?" I mean, how is this working out?
I can't remember actually. I think no, I didn't DM them for feedback. I didn't DM them to tell them I had feedback. I feel like that's kind of presumptuous.
Right.
I think what did I do? I think I tweeted something saying if anyone wants a VOD review, get in touch, something like that, and a bunch of people got in touch, and then people saw the first one that I did and got in touch for another one. I think that was basically how it happened. Yeah, I don't I don't like reaching out specifically because it feels like you're lecturing people. Like if you
Yeah.
reach out to someone, if someone reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have some advice for your Overwatch casting," I'd be like, "Okay, that's weird." I mean, I'd probably take it if I knew the person and knew that
Right.
they were pretty respected within the scene, but I would still consider it weird that they reached out. So, um, yeah, I think it's easily taken the wrong way, and you can
Right.
feel like the person that's trying to, I don't know, puppeteer the scene or something. But if you just put, I was open to doing some reviews for people, and people got in touch.
Yeah, that's why I asked, though. I was just like, "Is he so just, like, blatant as to DM this guy?" But, that makes a lot
Yeah,
more sense. I do think there's, like I mean, between you and Uber and then some of the other guys, if you, like, YouTube search, like, Cast Your Beginnings or Teaching Cast or something like that, I feel like there is going to be a market very soon for the commentators well, the on-camera workers, I should say, just in general,
mm,
actually providing coaching for these up-and-coming esports,
yeah,
commentators as well. And I mean, it's not always going to be like the altruistic thing. It's not always gonna be great. I'm sure there's going to be, as there is for many things in esports, the esports, shit, what is it? The advisor, what is that position that
yes,
Slash always makes fun of? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And you're just like, "Who is this guy? Like, what?" And they're gonna be making money off it, I'm sure, but I do think it's gonna be an avenue, especially for people who are doing freelance stuff. 100% if some of these guys, said, like, "I'll $50 and I'll then spend an hour with you," I jump on it as well, which I'm kind of low key doing with this podcast. I'm secretly just gathering all the
exactly.
information, getting all the advice, and just keeping it all to myself. No,
But that's the other thing as well. People are so willing to give that stuff away for free that there
they
isn't going
are.
to be a market for it because you can't possibly price yourself at like $50 when everyone's giving it away for free.
I mean, it'll happen eventually. There's a ton of
It
free
will.
coaching in every esport as well, but of course, there's also a ton of paid coaches. So I think it's gonna happen. It's my predicament or my prediction for 2022. I'm gonna
Yeah.
say. Gonna
I think
gonna put
that's
that
quite
in.
likely too. The Overwatch League actually has been really good in that they tried very early on to get talent coaches and voice coaches and stuff like that for people who wanted them. And so I did some voice coaching early on in 2018, I think. Maybe that was 2019. The years have blurred together at this point. Um, but I did multiple months of voice coaching, and then also worked with a not a talent manager, but an on-camera coach who was talking about kind of voice and how you present yourself on broadcast and this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, though, those kind of people are very difficult to find. And so
Right.
after the first talent coach that the Overwatch League got, he went to a different role, a different job, and they never were able to find anybody who was as good again, because they are so specific and so niche. And the people that have actually worked at that level in terms of the production and working with enough high level talent to be able to understand how that all operates, generally speaking, have better jobs than just coaching other talent. Like the system isn't developed enough for that to be a thing. There isn't enough money in the scene to be able to support it at the moment. But definitely, as things grow and as current talent evolves into being other stuff, like the CS people going into general manager or coaching, and then a bunch of other talent within the scene maybe moving into other roles. Um, I think those are absolutely options that would benefit up and comers.
I mean, I think they are starting to appear, not those specific coaches, but just in general, these ideas that are common complaints. Like, talking to Gillyweed about her role in psionics, for Rocket League, and I was like, yeah, it's really obnoxious because you try and, like, there's a very big disconnect between the guys who are working on this league and the talent that appear. Right, basically, we're the last ones hired. We don't really get to involved with the production. We just kind of show up and go like, oh, they definitely missed this, this, and this, and she was kind of saying that she had a job that actually kind of fit that as a liaison slash talent manager
Mm,
slash player slash kind of everything. That I was like, oh man, that actually makes so much sense. I'm so glad someone is trying to fill these roles
yeah,
that are missing. And I loved hearing about the that Overwatch did provide options, as well as apparently League of Legends Riot has done as well, which
right, yeah.
I'm have to try and get one of them on and speak about it. But that's awesome stuff. Is there any like big bullet points, just a couple things that you would say you learned and that stuck with you the most from these lessons?
Um, the I think so. I did way more voice coaching than I did the other talent coaching because, like I said, the guy that was excellent at it ended up disappearing and he went to a different job. So from the voice coaching side, um, a lot of it was just breathing control. I think that was something that I was missing when I was on the desk. I felt like a lot of the segments on the desk are, here's a great idea, compress it into 30 seconds of articulate speech and deliver it effectively. And also, it was a lot of like on the fly talking as well. So Puckett would shoot me a question and I would try and answer it, talking about the game or talking about who I think has an advantage in a certain fight or a certain meta or whatever. And what I was finding was that when I was on the broadcast, a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, but occasionally, I would find myself talking and talking, and I was trying to explain a point, and I was trying to do it with a lot of energy as well, because I'm on broadcast. And then I get to the end of my breath, and I'm like, "Oh for shit! Now I've run out of breath." and so that working on that and finding natural pause points and working on breathing, being more conscious and effective, which again is not something that anyone ever thinks about. But breathing is literally just moving parts of your muscles in order to suck air into your lungs. And so, depending on which muscles you move, can affect how your breathing occurs. People think of it again as an incredibly natural thing that you can't really coach or change, much like personality traits, but you totally can. So that was a big thing that I personally worked on. Um, and then for the talent coaching, a lot of it was in combination with the production. It was a lot of stuff that we worked on in early on in the Overwatch League in terms of finding our voice on the broadcast and being able to set up a system where the assets that we were using were complementing what we were saying and weren't completely driving the broadcast instead of us. So it was a lot of the interconnection between us and production was kind of getting sorted out through this talent coaching mediation.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, the Overwatch League, I think, had a really, I mean, being artificial. I know it sounds like it's a bad word, but I'm gonna use it anyways. Like it was built up. It wasn't one of those things that started from like something in someone's house to something in a studio to
Yeah.
something in a bigger studio. It was just kind of appeared. I think it was really difficult to know exactly what type of balance they wanted between being, like NFL, except for esports, or if it wanted to kind of go along more so with the homegrown people having fun aspect and finding that balance. I actually think it was actually quite due to a lot of the talent that you guys have on the desk and as commentators. Because one, Overwatch is a super difficult game to cast. I tried it twice, and I was like, "What the fuck?"
Yeah.
And then two, just to have that much pressure because all the eyes are on Overwatch League as
Yeah.
well for what it's doing, and I think you guys have done a fabulous job. I've listened to other esports, honestly, and a couple of them that are pretty big with some very established casters, and I'm just like, I don't like that type of casting. Like, I don't like this esport. Like, what's going on here? But then I'll
Mm.
listen to you guys in the Overwatch League or the CS:GO casters, and I'll be like, no, like I actually think there is just like a better quality of commentating compared to some other esports that I won't name, just so I don't
Yeah.
anger anyone I may have on the podcast in the future. But anyways, yeah, great stuff you guys are doing over the Overwatch League, and I definitely hope to see you in other esports, whenever you can do it. But we're gonna wrap up the podcast here. I've had you for 90 minutes. I don't want to keep it for too much longer, but I do have a Patreon question from
Sure.
one of my supporters. So he says, "Do you think esports will be able to attract people who aren't a fan of the given game or at least familiar with the mechanics? If so, are certain esports better made for this than others?"
Yeah, that's it's a really interesting question. It's something actually that the Overwatch League grappled with as well. Is the core of this question, because the Overwatch League was started, like you said, with really big ambitions about being the like the kind of NFL of gaming, where you're moving around from place to place, trying to play as many games as possible and visit various cities, and everyone's got local representation, etc., etc. But the kind of one of the core issues with that idea of esports is that unless you're familiar with the game, at least in a sense that you've casually played it and you understand what all the heroes do, you're not going to get how it works. It's not the same as the NFL, for example, because in the NFL, if I watch the NFL, I am a human. I have interacted with a ball before. I understand the physics of humans and balls. I get it, right? Like if someone did a double backflip on the field, my mind would be blown because I understand as a human how hard that is to do. I already have all of that experience to be able to understand what I'm witnessing. That applies to every traditional sport, every stick and ball sport. You just fundamentally know as a person what it's like to be a person. You might witness people doing stuff that you've never seen before, and you might not quite understand how much athleticism goes into something, but you can appreciate that they are doing some wild shit. But when it comes to esports, if you haven't played the game, you don't understand the limitations of all the characters. You don't understand the universe that they're in terms of like how much health everything has, how much damage everything does. Does fall damage exist? Does spam damage? Are you accurate when you're moving or not? All of these different rules are different between different games, and you have no intuitive experience that you can rely on unless you're very familiar with the game that you're watching, or it's really similar to one that you're currently involved with. Um, so I think that was something that a lot of esports have really run into troubles with. Now, I think it doesn't matter that much, though, for a couple of reasons. One, the player base of most of these games is enormous. So if you're able to translate even a small percentage of the player base of the games, like I think Overwatch just put out a thing recently that it had like, God, I might mess this up, but I think it had how many million monthly active users did it have recently? I'm just going to quickly Google that because I know that it was pretty big. It was 10 million. Yeah. 10 million monthly active users, which is pretty good um, for a game like Overwatch. Now, Overwatch also, if you were able to attract, I don't know, 1% of that, if you took the 10 million and you tried to attract 10% of those viewers to tune in every time to your game, well, you've already got 100,000 people there that are going to tune in on a monthly basis to your broadcast. You don't need to go way outside of the game in order to attract that target audience. But if you want to, then you need games that are mega simple to understand, I think. Games like Rocket League is a great one because it's a ball, and if you hit the ball, you know what ball physics are. It also shares a lot of similarities to football, like as in soccer football. So people understand ball goes in net equals point. They're very familiar with that concept of how traditional sports work. Or things like CS is like when you're getting to this is a pretty hardcore video game, but it does have some appeal, even if you don't know the game that well, because you can explain to your grandpa who's never watched esports before, oh, you're watching from the first person view of a guy, and it's going to flip from guy to guy. If they shoot the other people in the head, they're gonna
That's good.
get the kills and win the round. Like it's pretty simple to explain the basics, and then there's a lot of depth that you can explore afterwards. So those kind of games, I mean, even though when you stretch that to Valorant, I think you're starting to push it at that point. Because even though it might have more casual appeal in terms of being a bit prettier and having a bunch of different characters and stuff like that, actually understanding what each person does, like one of them can res people, the other has a turret that they can put down. Like if you're a casual viewer and you're trying to get into the game, you're really going to only focus on the gunplay. So even if you make those slight adjustments in terms of complexity, it's already getting pretty difficult to understand if you're trying to explain it to like your grandpa or your grandma that isn't familiar with esports at all. So I don't think that there is going to be a game that pops in the mainstream that much, but also I don't think that that's a problem at all. Like the way to pop off as an esport is to translate your players into viewers, because there are millions of players of video games. There are billions of players of video games, if we're being real about it. But for any specific game, there are millions. And if you are able to get a fraction of those and convert them into viewers, you have an incredibly sustainable esport to go and work with. So I think that's the thing that all developers should be focused on at all times is like explainers of how your game works in the middle of a tournament are nonsense. You want to be explaining how the esports side of it works for a casual viewer. You don't want to be explaining how the game works. Like, who are you aiming that towards? I, that yeah, I mean, I could go on a rant about that. I've seen those in so many games. They happened in Overwatch years back as well, and I hated them when they happened in there as well because it's just nonsense. Like if you have to explain how a map works to a viewer, then they're not going to stick around anyway. You're better off entertaining them or providing them with a cool factor. People will stick around if they see something flashy and cool. People will stick around if they're entertained. They're not going to stick around for a video lecture on how the game works.
Yeah, I think Overwatch League had a benefit of doing that. The idea of having a city connected, because even my friends who never got into StarCraft 2 esports, I'll never forgive them, but they got into Overwatch League esports when it first was announced because they just
Yes.
chose a city, and
Yes, and
that's who
that
they
has
cheered
been
for.
that has been huge actually for Overwatch. That was something that Overwatch has done very, very well. The amount of engagement as well with the fans to their specific city seems to be much higher than in other esports as well. Where in other esports you'll be a fan of a player or a game, fan of a player or a team or something, the amount of like translation into engagement there doesn't seem to be enormous. But for Overwatch, even when it was first announced and the game was very, very young, there would be I would guess something like 30% of the audience was wearing jerseys. I've never been to a tournament where there was that high of a percentage wearing merch that they had bought. And they couldn't possibly know anything about the teams that they were supporting because the league had just begun. So it's
Yeah.
like there's no way these guys were in-depth fans of the players that were on the teams. They'd been sucked in by the team aspect and the good branding and the fact it was associated with the city. That's something that Overwatch League did very, very well.
Yeah, I had two friends. We actually lived near DC, but this is before DC had a team. One chose Houston, and the one chose Dallas, and it's just like they don't come
Yeah.
from Dallas, they don't come from Texas. Like they just were like, these have pretty colors, and this guy looks more handsome than the rest. And that
Yeah.
was one of the reasons. But it does work out that way. So I mean, I think it's still going to be it's going to be one of those just like the question of esports eventually. I think because when it comes to sustainability and having to have a consistent player base, that does put some pressure some more pressure, right, on an esport to also be a good video game for decades,
Mm,
which, Brood War still has a scene mostly in Korea though, and that's the longest esport really that stayed the same,
sure.
and that can't be upwards to the 100,000 viewers all the time. That's going to be really difficult, and then it's also going to be in combination with the whole idea of like publishers controlling their esport versus no one owns football, even though the NFL
Yeah.
clearly does the best work with it. I mean, these are all questions that are going to be they're going to pop up, eventually. They already are popping up. People are having talk shows about, how is CS:GO really going to be the esport indefinitely? Is that really possible? Or is it also going to eventually have to have CS no, I don't know, the next CS:GO game,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's gotta advance on. Tough questions, and Overwatch is even kind of maybe approaching some of those questions too with the whole idea of Overwatch 2 coming out.
Sure.
Is that gonna
I
try and
think
revitalize the scene or what?
I think clearly League of Legends is the closest that any game has got yet to true mainstream appeal of being able to pick up a mainstream audience or get big enough with its esport to the point where it's attracting major interest from people who have no interest in League of Legends. Like whenever Worlds is going on, all of my esports friends are talking about it, even if they don't play or only play very, very casually. It definitely attracts all attention because it's this snowball effect. Once it gets big enough, everyone's tuning in to watch it because it's such a big spectacle. And they've really got that positive feedback loop running. But until they run into that issue, until League of Legends has to solve the issue of we don't have enough players to tap into, let's try and go even more mainstream. Like, I'm just gonna leave it to them to sort it out because, like, if they're that enormous and they struggle with like the next step, then clearly the actual next step isn't really going to happen in my opinion. Like you would have to fundamentally redesign all of the games so that they were mega more mainstream oriented, and even then would they even be fun games? Would they even pop off as the esports? Like would they even get popular enough with gamers to get mainstream at that point? I don't think you need esports to be as big as the NFL for them to succeed. Like success within esports can be huge, but more ephemeral, where it only lasts um for what a decade, maybe 15 years max, and then it peters out again and some new version takes its place. Like that would be perfectly fine. There's no reason that they have to stick around for 50, 100 years. Um people's interests change, and I don't see any reason why the games couldn't change with them.
I guess it's a rather, like, delicate spot for me and the people in the RTS scene since, very much that it seems that people don't really wanna make a new RTS except people who
Yeah,
are already making RTS, so Frost Giant's on board, but they let's see what actually happens with
yeah,
them, but, shooters, people can say, like, "I'll just hop onto the next battle royale, I'll hop onto the next arena shooter." Until maybe that, falls out of favor, like, who knows really what the future holds, and that's, I mean, it's kind of weird. I don't wanna keep your time too much, but it is kinda weird though because I gotta imagine, like, back when football was first getting popular, so let's just say back in, like, the 1920s, because I don't actually remember when football got popular. Like, were they thinking of like, this will be 100 years from now still being played on, like, national television to everyone, and we're gonna worry about our broadcast numbers and whatnot? Probably not. They were just like, "We're gonna, try and work with what we have now." And then slowly upon the years, the decades, then there was the bidding wars over, like, who could actually broadcast, then ESPN came in and kind of changed the landscape of broadcasting sports, and anyways, as I said, I don't wanna keep her too long, but it is kinda weird how we're so eager to compare to traditional sports,
yeah. We're nowhere
when it
near.
yeah, exactly, we're nowhere near, it's like, there's so much to be proven, it's just it's also just completely different, like anyways, I think in general, a lot of esports people, no matter what you're doing, basically, we can only look so far. We can only be like 5 years, I kind of have an idea what I wanna do, but anything longer than that, and it's pointless, basically.
It is,
Guess what's
yeah.
gonna happen.
It is impossible to kind of predict what will happen in the future as well. And trying to predict that kind of stuff is that, that's where the VC firms that's their kind of
Yeah.
domain. So
That's very
Yeah,
funny.
that's the only aspect that's quite interesting when it comes to this as well, is that those kind of predictions for the future influence quite heavily the investment within the scene, because a lot of these people are investing expecting, the scene to flourish and become extremely profitable at some point in the future, or if not profitable, then at least have massive amounts of revenue in the future. So yeah, but that stuff is so far above my pay grade and impossible to predict that I don't even bother wondering about it. Just take the day to day.
Exactly, yeah. All right, well, that's a good end point. Thank you so much for sticking around for a couple extra minutes to answer my questions and just answer a little bit. But I really appreciate you coming on. I think it was an amazing conversation. As I said, I really respect you guys over on the Overwatch League and what you've done with such a difficult game and the product that you were expected to deliver. So just well done on all fronts. And just now, I ask you to shout out where people can find you and what you might be doing in the near future.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it. You can find my stuff at twitch.tv/sideshow or twitter.com/sideshow gaming, which I'm so glad that you didn't call me sideshow gaming at the beginning, because it's just a horrible suffix that I had to add in order to get a unique Twitter account. And I frequently go on the podcast and people are like, hello, I'm joined by sideshow gaming. And I'm like, how did I do this to myself? I just created the worst alias possible. Yeah, you can find most of my work over there, or you can tune into the Overwatch League and catch me live whenever the season kicks back up again in the spring of 2021.
Yeah, awesome stuff. Hopefully by then we'll be talking about some more offline stuff
Yeah.
as well. That'd be great. All right. Thank you all for listening or watching, whatever you're doing. And then please check out the Patreon. And hope you enjoyed the episode. And I look forward to seeing you guys in 2 weeks for yet another episode. Bye.